Well, welcome to an exciting edition of Sam's screencast, I guess we'll call it. This time we're looking at IP friend or foe. So we've got the 4 readings that were the minimum readings, the intellectual property through Wikipedia. If intellectual property is neither intellectual nor property, what is it? Kinsella's against intellectual property and the case against intellectual property, the video we watched. I went ahead and pulled in a couple of outside sources too. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to run through and kind of hit on on these 4 sources. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about my personal view on intellectual property, and then we'll jump into the additional sources I went ahead and grabbed to kind of support my view. So first we'll just jump into the intellectual property at Wikipedia. So this one, super helpful as a first introduction to intellectual property. I say it regularly, and I still stand behind it. I'm learning all of this. I consider myself a digital technology noob. So, hadn't really put a lot of thought into intellectual property, especially how it would apply to digital media. This was helpful, but one thing I particularly liked about it, or the one thing it did go through and offer, some different terms, some history, the law surrounding it, very in-depth. But my takeaway was actually this sentence right here. Let me find it. Well, I'm not seeing exactly where it lights off, and since you don't want to listen to a whole bunch of dead time, I did go ahead and write it down. It was balancing rights so that they're strong enough to encourage the creation of intellectual goods, but not so strong that they prevent the goods' wide use in the primary focus of modern intellectual property law. And that kind of got me thinking, and definitely a theme or a thread through all of the sources that I found, that intellectual property, needing to be protected in order to drive innovation, but not protecting it to the extent that it hinders innovation. Kind of that perfect balance, which I think is what we strive for in a lot of things with technology. But jumping to the next article, if intellectual property is neither intellectual nor property, what is it? This article jumped into intellectual property. It explained that the very purpose of property and property rights was to better manage the allocation of scarce resources. If a resource is infinite, it no longer matters who owns it because anyone can own it, and it doesn't diminish the ownership of anyone else. So this kind of advances our understanding of intellectual property from that Wikipedia article, and opens up the question of digital intellectual property. I understand property rights and property laws as they compare to a house, a finite resource, gold, goods, something that has a monetary value and can be depleted. Intellectual property, while it still has value, there's an unlimited amount of views that a video can receive on YouTube. There's infinite numbers of copies can be made to a song that's been played. So it becomes that issue of is this property? Is it intellectual property, or does it need another term? And the author goes in and explains a few alternate terms that would fit better than intellectual property. Intellectual monopoly, as they debated, as Thomas Jefferson and James Madison debated in the formation of the Constitution. Intellectual privilege, as far as explains that I was just reading there, that intellectual privilege is a bit cumbersome. Imaginary property is a little too broad, so it offers some alternative terms instead of intellectual property, but none of them are necessarily a easily applicable or widely accepted alternative. But just drives that thinking a little bit more of, is intellectual property even a term that would make sense in terms of the digital world. So jumping into the third one, our much longer reading, and for the sake of brevity, I'm just going to hit on some high-level takeaways. Against intellectual property. So against intellectual property really dove into why intellectual property wouldn't want to be why we wouldn't want to widely support intellectual property, and got into a lot of good reasonings, a lot of libertarian versus unitarian definitions. One thing that I really took away from this one was that it once again got into the property versus intellectual property difference, and if something can be widely manufactured, if something can be widely duplicated, is it in fact property? And I feel like that's a thread that really applies to the digital applications of intellectual property. Because while it is something that's been created, research has been done, something's been discovered, it's not actually a limited good. There can be an infinite number of applications to it. The fourth one, which I won't play any of the video, but just the case against intellectual property. Some very compelling reasons for doing away with intellectual property, really driving on innovation being that we stand on the shoulders of giants, and that in order to continue to innovate, that intellectual property hampers innovation. Very convincing arguments, and this is where I'll kind of jump into my own takeaway. I don't know that I totally buy into intellectual property hampering technological advances. While I'm not necessarily 100% for intellectual property, I'm not 100% against it either. I agree that there needs to be some sort of reform to it, but intellectual property laws in their purest form exist to decrease the risk of potential innovators. And I'm a little bit closer to this one than some. So my mom is actually an inventor. She works in the field of medical devices, but she runs a one-person office out of her basement and has for 20 years now. Her background, she worked as a quality control engineer at a pharmaceuticals production company. Then she went over and worked as a quality controls engineer at a plastics manufacturing company. What she figured out was that there were applications in plastics manufacturing that could be applied to distribution of different drugs and make them safer to handle for the people that work with them regularly, less reactive. Very small business, but she holds a couple of patents, and I've seen the type of time and money investment she makes in, conceptualizing an idea, coming up with a model, finding out if it's commercially viable, going out and trying to convince those early adopters to use it. And honestly, most of the things she's done, if they ever make a profit, she's several $100,000 in the hole before she ever, starts making money off of an idea. Now, I'm not talking about the giant conglomeration think tanks. This is one person with some unique experiences using them to build something in their basement and try to make it commercially viable. I can see intellectual property laws and patent laws and how they benefit her, because she's taking an enormous risk every time she has another idea to try to bring it to market. And if she were to bring it to market, propose it to a large company, because mostly when you're dealing with pharmaceutical drugs, there's a few big players out there and not a lot of mom and pop shops. If she were to take one of these ideas, one of these concepts that wasn't patented, and propose it to one of these massive corporations, they have the resources, they have the capital, they could easily take it and manufacture it at a much lower cost, widely using it, and she would be totally out her time and money investment. At the same time, the same laws that protect her and her business protect the businesses that she's at risk of them taking away her market share. Those drug manufacturers that go in and are able to claim intellectual property on research and prevent other people from entering the market. And most of the time that's at the detriment of consumers. So one of the articles I found, Protecting Intellectual Property, the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Specifically in this one, I liked that it addressed medicine, another concern for intellectual property. Because like I said, I'm not for and I'm not against, but specifically thinking about like EpiPens. Those are a life-changing device for a lot of people, and they are astronomically expensive and were for years, yet universally needed. At the point that the EpiPens the patent was up and they were able to go generic, they became available for a fraction of the cost. At what point, during that time period of regaining their initial capital investment, did the pharmaceutical company become abusive, continuing to charge high prices after they had regained their capital? At what point of the profit do we say that that's okay? And that's where I think that intellectual property may need to be reformed, but not necessarily abolished. The other thing it highlights is intellectual property. In this article that I liked was intellectual property with pharmaceuticals claiming different herbs and remedies. And the one they speak about specifically is turmeric, using turmeric for wound treatment and how they were able to get that patented. Here we are. It's a turmeric, an Indian spice for wound healing. But it explains that turmeric had been used in wound healing in India for hundreds of years, but now an American pharmaceutical company has a patent on using turmeric for wound healing. When you get into claiming intellectual property on a plant, on something from the natural environment, I think you get into a really gray area. It's, why can't someone claim intellectual property on grass or oxygen or something that occurs naturally, and now all of a sudden people have to pay royalties in order to breathe or to have a yard? Like, it becomes very muddied. But I'm also not sure enough on how to fix it. The other thing, because like I said, I'm not against, I'm not for intellectual property. I'm for intellectual property when they're protecting the little guy, and I'm not necessarily for intellectual property when they're padding corporate greed. But looking at intellectual property, I did find another that was from the Global Innovation Policy Center that broke down kind of in the numbers intellectual property. So intellectual property industries employ over 55 million Americans. I thought that was pretty astounding. The other part there that I really liked was the average salary of intellectual property intensive industries pay $50,000 per worker compared to the national average of 38. So intellectual properties has created a big industry for itself that's paying people well, and as someone who's all in favor of jobs, that's a good thing. It also shows that the American intellectual property is worth $5.8 trillion more than the nominal GDP. And these industries also have 72.5% higher output per worker than the national average. So I don't think intellectual property is a bad thing. I think in the right cases, it can drive innovation as people with good ideas that potentially life-changing technology are more willing to take risks and try to bring them to market. At the same time, those same laws that protect the little guy are protecting companies that are taking advantage of consumers and taking advantage of the system. I liked the idea of, from the case against intellectual property, of that we stand on the shoulders of giants, that that no innovation exists without working off of other innovations. And so I'm not sure how that would work. I'm not sure what the reform would look like. I'm in favor of people having access to the research of others. I'm in favor of sharing intellectual property. But I'm also in favor of protecting it. So maybe what I personally like is weaker intellectual property laws, stronger patent laws, or maybe breaking out intellectual property into smaller segments and weakening and strengthening those. As far as digital aspects, I'm not sure how that's going to affect long term, because, well, I want people to continue to make music and movies and digital content. I don't want to pay astronomical prices for them, and I don't want to have my access to them limited. So it's a very for and against argument here, and I'm sorry I'm not able to take a hard line on any of it. I look forward to looking at other people's projects on this one and seeing if I can be convinced strongly one way or the other. Thanks for listening.